bride slapped the elderly black waitress at her own wedding, and for a second, time stopped. The smack echoed through the crystal ballroom like a gunshot. 300 guests froze, their glasses suspended midair. Every conversation died, every laugh evaporated, and all eyes turned toward the 64-year-old woman staggering backward, her trembling hand covering the red mark now blooming across her dark cheek. "You incompetent fool. You ruined my $50,000 dress." Victoria's scream ripped through the microphone still clipped to her gown. Her ice-blue eyes blazed with fury as she pointed to a few golden drops of champagne spattered across the shimmering Italian silk. What kind of place hires people like this to serve at real weddings? The waitress, Mrs. Ruth Silva, stood still. Her black uniform was immaculate, her gray hair pulled neatly into a bun, and yet humiliation burned hotter than any spilled drink. In 40 years of service, she had seen many things, but never had she been struck. Not in front of a ballroom filled with people dressed like royalty. The hall glittered beneath chandeliers of pure crystal. White flowers from Holland perfumed the air, and a 5-tier cake, worth more than any worker's yearly salary, stood proudly beside a marble staircase. It was the picture of perfection, a fairy tale orchestrated by Victoria herself. "Someone get this woman out of my sight," she spat, her voice dripping venom, "before I call security." At the head table, Victoria's parents exchanged smug smiles. Finally, someone, they thought, was putting these people in their place. The waitstaff froze. No one dared move, but Ruth, with the quiet dignity of a lifetime of endurance, bent to pick up the shattered crystal flute. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a pain that went far deeper than any bruise. None of the glittering guests knew the truth about her, that 22 years earlier, this same woman had found an 8-year-old boy abandoned in the cold rain of Detroit. A boy she took home, raised as her own. A boy who grew up calling her Mom. A boy now standing at the top of the grand staircase, watching everything. His name, David Thompson, the groom. Their eyes met across the hall. In that single heartbeat, Ruth saw recognition, shock, and then something colder, something dangerous. David had seen it all. The woman he had promised to love until death had just humiliated the only person in the world he truly loved unconditionally. And as silence swallowed the room, David felt the foundations of his perfect life begin to crack. Years earlier, David Thompson had been the heir to nothing. He was just a thin, shivering boy, sitting alone outside an overcrowded shelter soaked to the bone, clutching a plastic bag with a faded photo of his dead parents and a one-eyed teddy bear. That night, Mrs. Ruth was leaving her second hospital shift. Tired, hungry, her feet aching in worn-out shoes. She spotted him sitting in the rain. "Hi, sweetie. Are you hungry?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. The boy didn't look up. "I don't have any money," Ruth smiled, a tired but warm smile. "Who said anything about money? Come with me. I'll make you some hot chocolate." That night, David slept on her couch. By morning, he was still there. And by the end of the month, he was calling her Mom. She never made the adoption official. She couldn't afford the lawyers. But in every way that mattered, David was hers. She worked 3 jobs to pay for his private schooling. She woke before dawn to clean offices, spent her days at the hospital, and her nights scrubbing restaurant floors. He grew up watching those hands. Hands that were always tired, always working, hands that never stopped giving. "Mom," he once said, "when I grow up, I'll buy you a big house." "You don't need to buy me a house." "Son," she replied gently, "just be a good man." When he was 16, David won a scholarship to an elite university. Ruth cried through the whole graduation ceremony. Tears of pride, tears of loss. He was leaving for a world she could never understand. Even then, she worked extra shifts just to send him $200 each month. Money he didn't need, but she insisted on sending. He never knew how she managed until years later, when he found her bank statements and realized what she had sacrificed. At university, David excelled, bright, humble, focused. He worked part-time jobs, never partied like his rich classmates, and sent half his paychecks home. Within 5 years, he rose through the ranks of an investment firm. Within 10, he was a millionaire, respected, admired, and grateful. The first thing he bought wasn't a car or a penthouse. It was a small, comfortable house with a garden for his mother. "Mom, this isn't even the beginning of what I owe you." he said, handing her the keys. Ruth only smiled. As long as you're happy, that's enough. It was in that very house that David met Victoria, the daughter of powerful clients. Beautiful, charming, perfect on paper. She found the address through her social circles and arrived uninvited one Friday evening. The night David always spent with his mother. "I thought you lived in that fancy Manhattan building," she said, eyeing the modest home. "I do," David replied. "But I come here every week for dinner with my mom." Victoria forced a smile. "She's cute, very authentic." David didn't hear the insult hidden behind that word. But Mrs. Ruth did. As months passed, Victoria rarely visited again. She was always busy, important events, social obligations. And whenever she spoke about people like that, her tone carried something Ruth recognized instantly, the cold scent of superiority. Ruth said nothing, but a mother always feels the tremor before the storm. Now, 22 years after that rainy night in Detroit, the storm had arrived. In front of 300 witnesses, the woman David loved had slapped the woman who raised him. And at that moment, David Thompson, the boy who once trembled in the rain, felt something shift inside him. He stood perfectly still at the top of the staircase, his mind racing. He had built an empire on discipline and respect. And now, in the most public moment of his life, his bride had destroyed everything sacred to him with one cruel gesture. He took a slow breath. 23 seconds passed. Long enough for love to turn into ice. Long enough for forgiveness to die. Down below, Victoria continued laughing with her friends, mocking the clumsy maid who ruined her dress. Her parents beamed with pride, oblivious that their entire world was about to collapse. And the man they had just welcomed into their family was already planning his quiet revenge. Down below, Victoria continued laughing with her friends, mocking the clumsy maid who ruined her perfect gown. Her laughter echoed through the marble pillars, shrill, hollow, and cruel, a sound that no longer belonged to beauty. Some guests chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or look away. A few glanced toward the staircase, catching the unreadable expression on David's face. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply watched, memorizing every word, every smirk, as if his mind were taking silent photographs for a moment that would matter later. In that stillness, he remembered everything. The smell of rain on Detroit pavement, the rough wool of a second-hand blanket, the warm taste of his mother's first cup of hot chocolate, the hands that had lifted him out of darkness, the voice that whispered, "You're safe now, son." That memory struck harder than any slap. David's jaw tightened. The tuxedo that once made him feel proud now felt suffocating, like a costume borrowed from another man's life. He realized he had spent years climbing a mountain, only to discover it was made of glass. Fragile, transparent, reflecting faces that smiled without souls. Across the hall, Mrs. Ruth straightened her back and continued clearing the broken glass in silence. Every motion was careful, deliberate, dignified. Even humiliated, she refused to lose her grace. And that quiet strength, that refusal to bow, made the entire cruelty of the scene more unbearable. For the first time in his adult life, David felt something he had not felt since childhood. Helpless rage. But it wasn't the rage of a boy anymore. It was the calm, calculating fury of a man who understood power, influence, and timing. The orchestra resumed softly, a desperate attempt to smooth over the awkward silence. Waiters returned to service. Guests whispered, pretending nothing had happened. But the air had changed, heavy, electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Victoria posed for photos again, the same delicate smile plastered on her face, utterly unaware that the fairy tale she had built was already cracking beneath her jeweled heels. And at the top of the staircase, David Thompson's eyes darkened. In that moment, the man who had built an empire made a silent vow that by dawn, every mask in this room would fall. The wedding dinner shimmered under crystal chandeliers, but the light felt colder now, thin, artificial, and sharp. Guests returned to laughter, toasts, and selfies, pretending the slap never happened, pretending cruelty could be erased by champagne bubbles. David sat beside Victoria at the head table, his fork untouched, his eyes distant. Her hand slid over his, the perfect performance of a loving bride. But he didn't squeeze back. He could still hear the sound, that hard, humiliating crack echoing across the hall, and it played in his head like a drumbeat. Across the room, Mrs. Ruth moved quietly between tables, collecting plates, offering smiles that never reached her eyes. Every gesture was grace under fire, the mark of a woman who'd seen too much and endured far worse than one spoiled bride's tantrum. James, David's oldest friend and best man, leaned close and whispered, "You all right, brother? You look like you've seen a ghost." David's voice was low. "I just did. Her name's Ruth." James frowned, glancing at the older woman. "Wait, you mean that's Mrs. Ruth? The one you told me about? The one who raised you?" David nodded. "She was more than that. She saved me, and my bride just humiliated her in front of the world." For a moment, silence filled the space between them. The music faded beneath the noise of clinking silverware. James looked at him, really looked, and saw something shifting in David's expression. A quiet decision taking form behind his calm eyes. "David," he warned softly, "don't do something you'll regret." David's gaze stayed on Victoria. "Regret?" he murmured. "No, I've done plenty of that already. Now it's their turn." Later, when the first dance began, Victoria floated across the floor like nothing had happened. The crowd adored her again, capturing every twirl, every flash of her diamond smile. But David's steps were heavy, controlled, each one echoing with unspoken truth. As the song ended, Victoria whispered against his ear, "Try to smile, darling. Everyone's watching." "I know," he said quietly. "That's the point." He excused himself and walked toward the service corridor, the one leading to the kitchen where Mrs. Ruth worked. The sound of celebration faded behind him, replaced by the hum of refrigerators and the clatter of dishes. When he found her, she was standing alone, carefully folding a stained napkin as if it mattered. "Mrs. Ruth," he said softly. She turned, eyes widening. For a heartbeat the years vanished, and she saw not the billionaire groom, but the trembling boy she once rescued from a foster home. "David," she whispered. "You shouldn't be back here." He stepped closer, voice breaking. "I should have found you years ago. I didn't even know you were in this city, and now I watch my own wife treat you like that." She reached out, touching his hand gently. "Don't you dare apologize for her," she said firmly. "You've worked too hard to come this far. Don't let hate drag you down again." He looked at her, and the warmth in her eyes was the same as it had been decades ago. It cut through his anger, but it couldn't erase the truth. "I can forgive the world, Mrs. Ruth," he said quietly. "But I can't forgive her. Not tonight." From the hallway came the faint sound of Victoria's laughter again, loud, cruel, unknowing. Mrs. Ruth shook her head. "She's not worth your peace, child." But David smiled, and there was nothing peaceful in it. "Peace?" he said. "I'm not looking for peace." He walked out of the kitchen, his mind already assembling the first pieces of a plan. By morning, he promised himself, no one in that glittering room would see him as a silent groom again. The orchestra swelled as he returned, and Victoria beamed as if nothing were wrong. She raised her glass for another toast, to love, to success, to their future. David lifted his own, his voice calm, smooth, deliberate. "To truth," he said softly, and took a long, slow drink. The music from the ballroom faded into the background as David stood still in the hallway, his reflection shimmering faintly in a silver service tray. His pulse was steady now, too steady. The kind of calm that comes only before a storm. Every fiber of him wanted to storm back into that hall, to expose the hypocrisy beneath the diamonds and designer smiles. But rage without direction was noise, and David had never been a man of noise. He built empires in silence. Tonight he would destroy one the same way. When he returned to the ballroom, the lights had dimmed for the cake cutting. The massive six-tier masterpiece stood in the center of the floor, a monument to vanity. Victoria stood before it, flawless once more, her earlier cruelty buried beneath a practiced smile. Cameras flashed as she lifted the silver knife. "Come, darling," she said sweetly, her tone sugary and fake. "Let's make it perfect for the pictures." David joined her, placing his hand over hers on the knife handle. To the world, they looked like the picture of happiness. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the distance in his eyes, a storm building behind calm waters. "Perfect," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Everything tonight has been perfect," she giggled, mistaking his words for affection. And as the blade sliced through layers of icing and sugar, David's mind sliced through years of deception. He thought of the first time he'd met Victoria, her charm, her ambition, her hunger for status. How she had studied him, mimicked his dreams, fed him stories about love and destiny, while quietly weaving her web around his fortune. James watched from the crowd, uneasy. He'd seen that look before, not on David, but on soldiers who'd survived betrayal. The look that says, it's already too late to turn back. After the cake was served and speeches began, Victoria's father took the microphone. A man of wealth and political power, his voice boomed across the hall. "To my beautiful daughter," he declared, "and to the man who has made our family proud tonight, David Thompson, the finest example of success this city has ever seen." Applause erupted, but David barely moved. Every cheer sounded hollow. Every smile felt rehearsed. He leaned back, whispering to James, "You know what's funny about success?" James looked at him warily. "What's that?" David's lips curved in a thin smile. "It shows you who people really are, especially the ones who never clapped when you started." Victoria glanced at him, sensing something strange in his tone. "Smile, honey," she murmured again through clenched teeth. "We're live on national TV." "I know," he said, still smiling faintly. "Everyone's watching. That's what makes this so beautiful." Her laughter faltered. "David, what's that supposed to mean?" But before she could press further, another speech began, one from her maid of honor. The guests turned their attention forward, and David's voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her. "You humiliated a woman who raised me," he said softly. "Right here, in front of cameras, in front of the world. You think you buried that moment with champagne and smiles, but you didn't. You built it into history." Victoria's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of unease behind her perfectly drawn lashes. "David, it was a mistake. She spilled wine. She spilled wine," he repeated, his tone chillingly calm. "And you spilled your soul." She forced another smile for the cameras, but her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. The crowd laughed at a joke from the stage, and David leaned back, pretending to enjoy himself. Inside, though, his plan was already forming into motion. He turned to James again. "Do you still have that drive I gave you last week?" "The one with the company security files?" James asked quietly. David nodded. "Good, keep it close. Before this night ends, we're going to use it. But not the way anyone expects." James frowned. "David, what are you planning?" "Not revenge," David murmured. "Correction." Meanwhile, Mrs. Ruth finished her shift quietly and prepared to leave. She walked past the back hallway, clutching her small purse. The security guard nodded politely, and she smiled faintly, a tired, gentle smile. She never expected gratitude, never asked for kindness. But as she reached the exit, she paused. Something told her the night wasn't over. Back in the ballroom, David rose for a final toast. He tapped his glass, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and steady, "tonight has been a night to remember. Not for the glamour, not for the fame, but for something far more valuable. Truth." Victoria blinked, smiling awkwardly. The cameras turned toward him. Reporters leaned forward. "Truth," he continued, "is the one thing money can't buy and power can't fake. And tonight, I'd like to share a little truth of my own." The room fell utterly still. Even the orchestra stopped. Victoria's father shifted in his seat. David glanced toward the back of the hall, toward the doorway where Mrs. Ruth had just reappeared, drawn by his voice. Their eyes met for one brief second, and he gave a small, reassuring nod. "Truth," he said again, "isn't always beautiful, but it's always necessary." He lifted his glass higher. "To the people who made us who we are, not the ones who polished our crowns, but the ones who carried our burdens when no one else would." The guests exchanged confused looks. Victoria's smile froze completely. Her father's jaw tightened. And David knew the stage was set. A hush spread across the ballroom. Every crystal in the chandelier seemed to tremble, catching the light like frozen raindrops. David stood tall, his glass raised, and the cameras zoomed in, live, unblinking, curious. "To the people who made us who we are," he repeated, his voice steady but carrying something deeper, something the crowd could feel but not name. He paused, letting the silence stretch. "For most of my life," he continued slowly, "I believed success meant rising above your past. That money could erase struggle, and power could rewrite pain. But tonight, I was reminded of something far greater. Success means remembering the hands that lifted you, even when the world forgot them. Whispers rippled through the audience. Victoria's perfect smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, turning toward the cameras with a laugh. "Oh, my husband," she said lightly, always so sentimental. David turned his head toward her. There was no anger in his eyes now, only clarity. "Do you know what sentiment really is, Victoria?" he asked softly. "It's the thing that separates human beings from masks." Her expression stiffened. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the edge in his tone. "Tonight," David said, "I saw a mask break. I saw cruelty dressed as elegance. And I realized that no amount of silk or champagne can hide the truth about character." Victoria's father rose halfway from his seat. "David, I think that's enough," he said with a warning smile. But David didn't even glance at him. His voice grew stronger, carrying across the room. "When I was 9 years old," he said, "I was homeless. I slept in an abandoned car on Jefferson Street. The world didn't care who I was or what I could become, but one woman did." He turned, gesturing toward the back of the hall. The cameras followed. Mrs. Ruth stood frozen by the doorway, tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't meant to be seen, but now every lens in the room was pointed at her. "She found me," David said, "hungry, scared, and alone. She gave me food when she had none for herself. She taught me dignity when I had nothing to my name. And tonight, in this very room, that same woman was humiliated, not by a stranger, but by my own bride." Gasps filled the air. Every guest turned toward Victoria. Her smile vanished completely now, her face draining of color. "This is absurd," she whispered. "She's lying." "Enough," David said, his voice sharp as steel. She didn't say a word. "You slapped her, mocked her, and called her beneath you. But the only person beneath anyone here tonight is the one who hides their cruelty behind class." Victoria's father stepped forward, his composure cracking. "You will not embarrass my family on national television," he snapped. "You think you can stand there and—" David cut him off with a calm, chilling smile. "Embarrass your family? I haven't even started." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. James, standing by the sound technician, nodded slightly. With one subtle motion, he inserted the drive into the media console. The massive LED screen behind the stage flickered. The live feed cut out, replaced by files, documents, images, videos. A silent gasp rippled through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said evenly, "for years the Crawford family has been admired for their influence, their charity, their spotless reputation. But let's take a look at what that spotless record hides." The first image appeared, a ledger showing millions siphoned from charity funds. Then photographs, luxury villas built under fake company names, contracts signed with politicians, bribes disguised as donations. Victoria's father went pale. "Turn it off!" he shouted, lunging toward the screen. But the guards at the corners, David's security, didn't move. They stood still, watching. The room buzzed with disbelief. Phones recorded everything. The livestream audience, numbering in the millions, was seeing every secret unfold. Victoria's voice trembled. "David, stop this! You're destroying us!" He turned toward her, his voice quiet but cold. "No, Victoria, you destroyed yourself the moment you thought you could buy respect and bury compassion." The footage continued. Emails between Victoria's father and corrupt developers, evidence of insider trading, and finally, a signed confession hidden in encrypted files. Reporters whispered frantically, some already typing headlines. David watched the chaos unfold, but his expression remained calm, almost mournful. "I built this empire with honesty," he said quietly. "I made mistakes, yes, but never sold my soul. And I will not be tied to anyone who thinks power is a license to dehumanize." Victoria backed away slowly, tears filling her eyes. "You planned this," she whispered. "You invited me into your life just to ruin me." David shook his head. "No, Victoria. I invited you because I believed in love. But tonight, you showed me what love isn't." The cameras kept rolling. The orchestra stood frozen, their instruments hanging mid-air. No one dared breathe too loud. Mrs. Ruth, still by the door, pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, not of joy, but of release. She had carried her silence for too long, and now the truth had finally spoken for her. David turned to her gently. "Mrs. Ruth," he said softly, "you taught me that dignity isn't something given. It's something kept. Thank you for never losing yours." The crowd began to clap, slowly, awkwardly at first, then louder, more certain, until the entire hall was filled with applause. Some were clapping for courage, some for the spectacle, and a few, just a few, for understanding what true class meant. Victoria's father shouted again, "You'll regret this, Thompson. You're finished." David looked at him one last time. "Maybe," he said calmly, "but I'll be finished clean." Security escorted the Crawfords toward the exit. Victoria stopped midway, turning back to David. "I did love you," she said quietly, voice breaking. "Once." David met her gaze, his tone soft but resolute. "Then you should have known that love without respect is just control in disguise." She looked at him one last time before walking out under 1,000 flashing lights. The doors closed behind her, and with them, the echo of everything false that had haunted David's life. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring, stunned. Some congratulated him, others kept their distance, unsure how to stand near the truth. David exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his body. He walked toward Mrs. Ruth, who was still trembling, unsure whether to smile or cry. "You shouldn't have done that for me," she said softly. "I didn't need vengeance." He smiled gently. "It wasn't vengeance," he said. "It was cleansing. For both of us." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, as if the sky itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, washing the dust and glitter from the marble steps. David walked out beneath it, the drops running down his face like forgiveness. For the first time that night, he wasn't performing, wasn't pretending. He was free. The rain fell harder, drumming against the city like applause from the heavens. Each drop carried a quiet rhythm, washing away the last traces of champagne, glitter, and lies that had clung to the night. David didn't run from it. He let the rain soak through his tuxedo, darkening the fabric, chilling his skin. For the first time in years, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders, not because justice had been served, but because truth had finally been spoken aloud. He looked up at the vast sky, its silver clouds swirling over the skyline, and thought of his mother, the woman who'd once told him that storms weren't made to destroy, but to cleanse. He had never understood that lesson until now. The storm didn't scare him anymore. It felt like home. From behind him he heard footsteps. Mrs. Ruth stood under the doorway, holding a small umbrella, hesitant to step into the downpour. Her voice trembled as she called out, "You'll catch your death out there, child." He turned and smiled faintly. "Maybe I needed to be reborn first." She walked toward him, the umbrella barely shielding her. "You've already been reborn, David. Tonight, you remembered who you are." They stood together in silence, watching the rain sweep the streets clean. In the distance, the neon sign of the hotel flickered, one letter at a time, until only a single word remained illuminated. Grace. David glanced at it and laughed softly. A genuine, unguarded laugh that hadn't left his chest in years. "You see that?" he said. "Even the city agrees," Mrs. Ruth smiled. "Maybe now you'll stop building empires for the wrong people." He nodded slowly. "From now on, I build for those who deserve it." The storm faded by morning. The city woke slowly, cleansed by the rain. Sunlight slipped through the clouds and painted the glass towers gold. David had barely slept. He sat by the window of his penthouse, still in the tuxedo from the night before, watching the world move on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside him, something irreversible had shifted. His phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from journalists, investors, friends, strangers. The video had gone viral overnight. 40 million views by dawn, climbing by the hour. Hashtags trended. Talk shows debated the wedding of the century. People called it justice. Some called it revenge. But David knew it was something deeper. It was the restoration of truth. He turned off his phone and brewed coffee in silence. On the counter sat the envelope of annulment papers, now signed, sealed, and ready for delivery. He took one last sip, folded the letter he had written for Victoria. A simple note that read, "I hope one day you learn what love truly means." Then he set it beside the envelope and left without another word. By the time he reached Mrs. Ruth's house, the garden was already alive with light. She was outside, trimming her rose bushes as if nothing had happened, wearing her old apron with the faded blue flowers. When she saw him, she smiled the same smile she had given him at 8 years old, the one that could quiet every storm. "Morning, son," she said softly. "Morning, Mom." He walked toward her, and for the first time in 22 years, he knelt, just as she had knelt beside him in the rain that first night. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he whispered. Mrs. Ruth touched his cheek. "You didn't cause it, David, but you ended it." "That takes courage." They sat on the porch with steaming mugs of tea while the neighborhood children played in the distance. The world suddenly felt small, human, and real again. "I've been thinking," David said. "All that money, all those parties, they never made me feel proud. But last night, when you walked into that hall, I realized what success actually looks like." Mrs. Ruth chuckled. "It looks like a tired old woman holding her purse?" "It looks like dignity," he said. "The kind no one can buy or fake." He told her about his plan, to build a foundation for underprivileged children, especially those without families. "We'll call it the Ruth Project," he said. "It'll give them the same chance you gave me." Her eyes filled with quiet tears. "Then that will be my greatest legacy." Weeks passed. The scandal faded from the headlines, replaced by newer gossip and fresher scandals. But what remained was the story people whispered about in offices, cafes, and dinner tables. The story of a groom who chose respect over reputation. David's business thrived. Clients doubled. Investors flocked to him not out of pity but admiration. They wanted to be part of something honest. He rebranded his company with a simple motto: "Integrity builds empires that last." Mrs. Ruth, meanwhile, became a quiet celebrity. Interviews poured in, but she accepted only one: a small local radio station where she spoke about grace and forgiveness. "Life will always test your character," she said on air. "But remember, dignity doesn't shout. It stands." The radio clip went viral too, but this time for a different reason. People shared it not to gossip, but to heal. 3 months later, Victoria stood behind the counter of a suburban department store, wearing a name tag that read Vicky S. She rang up purchases, smiled politely, and avoided the curious stares of customers who sometimes whispered her name in recognition. Every evening, she scrolled through her old social media pages, now ghost towns of forgotten glamour, and wondered how it had all collapsed so quickly. But fate had one more lesson. Part of her community service required her to volunteer at a local food program for the elderly. When she arrived for her first shift, she froze. At the front of the room, handing out aprons, was Mrs. Ruth. For a moment, time stopped. Mrs. Ruth's gaze was calm, not cruel. "Welcome," she said simply, handing Victoria a ladle. "We serve lunch at noon." Victoria wanted to disappear. The same hand she had once struck now guided her through the work: how to portion the soup, how to smile at each guest, how to listen instead of command. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the arrogance drained from her posture. One afternoon, she finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it." Mrs. Ruth studied her for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to others," she said. "It's the weight you stop carrying yourself." For the first time, Victoria wept, not from humiliation, but from the slow understanding of what she had become. And maybe, in some small way, that was the beginning of her redemption. A year later, David stood in the same garden where he'd once promised his mother he would build a better life. This time, it was decorated with white lights and wildflowers. Guests gathered, not 300 strangers, but 50 dear friends, colleagues, and children from the Ruth Project who ran laughing between the chairs. He was getting married again. But the scene couldn't have been more different. The bride, Dr. Elena Morales, was a physician who volunteered at free clinics. Her gown was simple, her smile radiant, her eyes sincere. Mrs. Ruth walked him down the short aisle, proud and peaceful. As they reached the altar, David looked around. No chandeliers, no photographers, just sunlight, laughter, and the hum of life. He took Elena's hands and said softly, "Everything I am, I owe to the woman sitting behind you." Mrs. Ruth dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, laughing and crying all at once. When the ceremony ended, she pulled her son into a hug. "You did it, David. You built the right kind of empire." That night, long after the guests had left and the candles had burned low, David and his mother sat on the porch again. Fireflies floated above the garden. The air smelled of roses and rain. "Do you ever regret anything, Mom?" he asked. "Only that I didn't plant more tomatoes," she joked. Then she grew serious. "Maybe I regret not resting enough when I was younger. But every tired day was worth it to see this." He took her hand gently. "You taught me that family isn't about bloodlines. It's about who stands beside you when everyone else steps away." She smiled. "And you taught me that love can come full circle." For a long while they said nothing, listening to the soft night sounds. Then Mrs. Ruth spoke again, her voice a whisper. "Remember, son, fame fades, wealth fades, but character, that's the only thing time can't touch." David looked at her, the woman who had changed the course of his life, and said, "Then I'll spend the rest of mine protecting that." Months later, the Ruth Project opened its first shelter in Detroit, on the same street where an 8-year-old boy had once been found sitting in the rain. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew crowds, cameras, and tears. David gave a short speech. 22 years ago, I was just a boy no one saw. One person stopped, offered me warmth, and changed everything. Today we honor that act, not with monuments, but with hope." He looked down at his mother, who stood in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's gratitude." The audience erupted in applause. Reporters wrote stories not about scandal, but about grace reborn. Children laughed in the courtyard as Mrs. Ruth handed out sandwiches. Her favorite job of all. As the sun set behind the city, David placed a hand on the wall plaque that read, "In honor of Ruth Silva, proof that love can raise empires and rebuild hearts." He closed his eyes, whispering, "We made it, Mom." Mrs. Ruth, standing beside him, answered simply, "We always would." And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled softly, not in warning but like applause from the heavens, marking the end of one storm and the beginning of another story entirely. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about a wedding or a scandal or even revenge. It was a story about grace, the kind that survives humiliation, endures hate, and turns wounds into wisdom. A story that reminds us that the truest power in the world isn't wealth or beauty or status, but the quiet, unstoppable strength of love. The night deepened, yet the air shimmered with quiet peace. Inside the new Ruth Project building, the lights glowed softly, casting long golden reflections on the rain-washed pavement. David lingered in the courtyard long after everyone had gone home, listening to the laughter that still echoed faintly from the walls. Each sound felt like a heartbeat, a rhythm of second chances. He walked slowly along the corridor where a mural had been painted by the children. Bright colors, messy lines, but a clear message at its center. You are loved. You are seen. You belong. He touched the painted letters gently, his eyes misting. You don't even know how true that is, he whispered. A soft wind blew through the open window, carrying the faint scent of roses from Mrs. Ruth's garden. It reminded him of every moment she had worked quietly in the background, every meal she had served, every prayer she had whispered when no one was listening. She had never needed an audience to be extraordinary. Her love had been her legacy. Outside, the city skyline shimmered under the moonlight, the same skyline that once mocked him with its indifference. Now it stood before him as a witness, a city reborn in his eyes, made beautiful not by glass or steel, but by mercy. David closed the main gate and looked up at the glowing sign one last time. Thank you, he murmured as if speaking to the stars themselves, for everything I lost and everything I found.